Hi, and welcome back. We're into lesson 4 of Hebrews. This week we're going to look at chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Now, whenever you first became a Christian, what did you think your life, or maybe even the church, would look like when you got to be the age that you are now? Is it what you expected? Have you ever looked at your life and wondered, how in the world did I get here? Maybe even wondered if you took a wrong turn somewhere along the line. When you find yourself on a road that really doesn't look like you thought it was supposed to look, sometimes you're going to need a pretty good reason to keep on going down that way. Well, that's kind of the feeling that I think the original readers of the book of Hebrews were dealing with. They had come to a place where, well, they'd started off, they'd grown up generation after generation. They'd built their lives around the temple and around the law of Moses and the sacrifices, but they had heard about Jesus, and they'd come to believe that he was the Messiah that they were always waiting for, and so they had put their faith in him. They had left Judaism behind, and they had become part of the kingdom of God, but no doubt they had certain expectations as to what that was going to look like, what it was going to feel like. And those expectations may have been somewhat frustrated as time wore on. What made things worse is they had friends and family around them all the time saying, you're making this really hard on yourself. Why are you doing this? You can come back home. You can come back to what you left behind. That frustration and that temptation, if the road got looking strange to them, I'm sure that it just grew and grew. Well, whoever wrote Hebrews knew that they were dealing with that, and knew that they needed a pretty good reason to keep on going down the road that they had taken. So he starts here in chapter 3 and begins through the rest of the book to make the argument and to prove to them that they have chosen wisely and that they are on the right road, regardless of how it might look to them at that particular moment. But he also says it's going to take a little bit more than a good reason to stay on this road. He ends this section saying it's going to require courage and hope. Well, we're going to read through this and see how we can apply it to ourselves. Hebrews chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Therefore, holy brothers, who share in the heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus, the apostle and high priest whom we confess. He was faithful to the one who appointed him, just as Moses was faithful in all God's house. Jesus has been found worthy of greater honor than Moses, just as the builder of a house has greater honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but God is the builder of everything. Moses was faithful as a servant in all God's house, testifying to what would be said in the future. But Christ is faithful as a son over God's house. And we are his house, if we hold on to our courage and the hope of which we boast. Now, why do you think we're told to fix our thoughts on Jesus? Well, to fix your thoughts means to consider, to look at it fully. There's a kind of a truism. Have you ever noticed that we tend to move towards whatever it is we're looking at? That can be a good thing and that can be a bad thing. Whenever I first started learning how to ride motorcycles, one of the things I was told is be careful where you look, because that's where you're going to go. If you've ridden a motorcycle, you know this. Whenever you come around a corner, you don't just turn the handlebars, you got to lean with it. Well, when you lean, the natural temptation is to look at the ground because it gets kind of close at times. But if you look at the ground, you'll crash. Why? Well, you tend to go where you're looking. The secret to getting a motorcycle through a curve is to look straight ahead where you want to go, and the bike will sort of find its way there. Now, you may not have to ride a motorcycle to see this in action. If you've ever been on a highway at night, driving a car, and you've got oncoming traffic, and you allow yourself to kind of look at those headlights coming at you, ever notice how the car tends to veer towards those headlights? You find yourself in the wrong lane if you don't catch it quick enough. Weird how that works. But that's the truth. What we look at fully, what we consider, what we fix our thoughts on, it's what we tend to move towards. It's almost as though we give it a certain power or a certain gravity. We need to fix our eyes on Jesus. We need to fix our thoughts on Jesus and allow that to move it towards him, and not towards what might be tempting us. We have kind of two examples that I can think of in Scripture that illustrate this. The first one would be Eve. Back in Genesis chapter 3, she was tempted, and she considered the temptation. She kind of thought about it and weighed her options. You know how that turned out. She ended up driving right square into it and falling. And another example would be, by contrast, Jesus in Matthew 4. Satan, he was led out in the desert and Satan had a go at him. Satan tried to tempt him, but Jesus refused to consider any other option other than being obedient to God and worshiping Him. And he drove straight for God. We're going to have to make that same determination to keep our thoughts focused on Christ, to fix our thoughts that way, to consider Him, to look at Him so that we end up driving and moving towards Him on this road that we're on, and not turn around and going back. Now, he starts off with telling us to fix our thoughts on Christ, and then he starts comparing Jesus to Moses, saying that Jesus is greater than Moses. Why do you think he starts making that comparison? Well, Moses was somebody that the Jews respected. They trusted him. They actually built their whole lives generationally around Moses. The point was that if you can trust Moses, how much more can you trust Jesus? Because Jesus is greater than Moses. Now, that argument may not sound quite as convincing to a 21st century American who really never knew much about Judaism and never worshipped at a temple in Jerusalem. But the plain fact of the matter is that we've all built our lives around something. We've all trusted something. Maybe it was your parents or your grandparents or your friends or the way that you were educated, or maybe you just learned to trust yourself. That's pretty much an American thing, isn't it? Well, the message is still the same. Jesus is greater than all those other options. And if we could trust those other things, how much more can we trust Jesus? Now, according to verse 6, we are God's house. Let's read it together. He says, "And we are God's house if we hold on to our courage and the hope of which we boast." Well, what does it mean that we're God's house? And why should that encourage us? Well, Ephesians 2:19 says, "Consequently, you're no longer foreigners and aliens, but fellow citizens with God's people and members of God's household." See, being a part of God's house means that we're no longer outsiders. Well, we may feel like it at times, depending on the context we find ourselves in, but we're actually insiders in God's kingdom. We're not foreigners. We're not aliens. We're actually citizens of another kingdom. And so when we sometimes don't fit in, it's because we do fit in with God. And that'll make it hard sometimes to fit in with people who are not in His kingdom. He also says, and it says in 2 Timothy 3 verse 5, that you will know how people ought to conduct themselves in God's household, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and foundation of the truth. This house that he's talking about in Hebrews, I think there's pretty good evidence to believe it's the church. The church is, it says here in 2 Timothy, the pillar and foundation of the truth. And that's about being in God's household. Well, pillars and foundations hold things up. They're things you can rely on. Well, being in God's house means that you're in a sturdy place that you can rely on. Yeah, it gets tough. It gets confusing. Sometimes it looks like something else that we didn't quite expect it to look like in following Christ. But yet it's the one thing that you really can count on. Now, he uses the word "if" there in verse 6. Did you catch that? He says, "And we are His house if we hold on to our courage and our hope." Why do you think he uses the word "if"? Well, because hanging on to our courage and our hope is an option. It's not necessarily a given that that's going to happen. I think I've said in other places, I was taught, that for every promise there's a premise. And the premise here is if we hold on to our courage and our hope, we can have the promise of being His house. Now, why do you think it takes courage and hope to stay in God's house? Well, I think sometimes the difficulty in understanding this is the way we use the word hope in English. Where I say, I hope the Cubs win the World Series, you pretty much know I'm talking about a wish, not something that I expect to happen. Something I hope happens is something that I wish would happen. But in the Greek, whenever Hebrews was written, the way that they used the word hope meant that they expected it to happen. See, in Romans 8:25, I think actually gives us a little bit of insight into this also. It says, "But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently." See, our hope, our expectation keeps us going when things get tough, when things don't look the way we expected it to. And it allows us to wait patiently for things to pay off. Well, staying in God's house requires us to have the courage to wait patiently and not to lose faith, especially whenever it gets to looking rough. Okay, here's the application assignment. What was your life like before you surrendered to Jesus? Are you ever tempted to turn back? And if you are, why haven't you? Question 2, what helps you to hold on to the courage, your courage and hope? What helps you to hold on? And lastly, how can you help someone else hold on to his or her courage and hope? All right, guys, it's a short lesson, but yet there's a lot to think about here, and be praying for you. I hope you have some great discussion time in your small groups, and we'll talk to you next time.